Hello, so today we're going to be going over the encounters in TFT set 13. The encounters appear at the start of the game, and we're basically going to talk about general strategies as well as ideas that you should have going into each game to try and get the most out of each of the encounters that appear. So, before much ado, please make sure to like and subscribe if you do like my content. If you're here returning from some of the other guides that I've done, I do daily content for TFT, so it would help me if you liked and subscribed for my content. Additionally, we have our sub goal of 5,000 subs, which are fast approaching. The goal this time is just going to give away some art store coupons. I'm going to be opening up my art store very soon, so art and merch is coming very soon for my channel. I used to have an art store. I used to do just primarily art as content, and then I switched over to TFT. So I'm going to restart doing that and maybe post some stuff on my art channel as well. But after that, once we reach higher sub counts, we'll also do RP giveaways in the future. So please make sure to like and subscribe if you like my content. Oh, sorry. Thanks for watching it at the end. Anyways, so the way this is going to be ordered is I ordered them by the percentage chance of them appearing as well as the alphabetical after that. So if you need to find them, it's going to be in order of that, but I recommend you watch the entire video. So no encounters. No encounters can happen 10% of the time. Basically, we'll say either Zon or Piltover, and it'll be like nothing's happening. So what no encounter means is that there's no real governing extra effect that's happening in the game from the start of the game. These ones are typically low variance, which means that you can basically play anything. Anything goes. Any strategy that you have could work. Win streaking, lose streaking, whatever comp you think is good or bad. Depending on your spot, it's basically the least interference, and you don't really have to govern a particular strategy. You might want to avoid certain things that have conditions, like if you're trying to play towards a very narrow comp that requires a lot of gold, you might need then gold augments or stuff like that in order to actually cap out your board properly. Because of that, you should always prioritize a mixture of augments. It usually gives you the best chance of not only hitting but being strong. So econ augments early can give you a lot of gold that you can hit the board that you want to hit. Additionally, combat augments can make your board strong because it's basically no encounter. You don't know how things are going to work out. You want to balance your augments and your augment choices as much as possible, and as well as with your leveling and where you play your board, win streak or lose streak. You basically want to balance it as much as possible. So, Heimer, Prismatic either first or last. So Heimer can appear 10% of the times. It's a split of 6% of the appearances of 6% of the appearances are going to be a first augment is Prismatic, and 4% are going to be a last augment Prismatic. Now this can be very low variance, but it also can be high variance because some of the Prismatics are very game breaking or game changing. There's not that many, so typically it's more of a low variance to just have one Prismatic augment because you can play around it. Especially with Prismatic first augments. A lot of times, no matter what Prismatic you take as your first augment, as long as it doesn't strictly govern your game, you still have two other augments that you can play around and fix up, right? So if you take a Prismatic combat start, you can worry about econ and other stuff later. Prismatic econ, you can find other combats to supplement that. Typically, it's more high variance if it's a Prismatic end, so the 4% chance of Heimer appearing. The reason there's a lot more variance is because Prismatic combats, when I say a combat augment, something that helps you with power, something like Bronze for Life that gives you a bunch of damage amp, things that give you attack speed, things that give you like a bunch of AP or AD. Typically, the Prismatic ones are skewed to be much more powerful. So a lot of boards, it doesn't matter what board you hit, sometimes a fight can be governed by who has the better combat augments if you have two similarly strength boards going up against each other. So when it's a Prismatic ender, sometimes if you don't have a good combat augment from your first two augment choice and then it rolls Prismatic at the end, you have to be prepared for the fact that some people might just hit a giant combat and make their board significantly stronger than everybody else. Meanwhile, you might have a problem where your board suddenly starts losing to a bunch of other boards that became very strong out of nowhere. When it's Prismatic first, you can kind of structure that a little bit more if you see somebody with a combat. And typically combat Prismatics aren't that strong early game because they don't do that much early game. So it's a lot. That's what I mean by it could be very high variance even though it's just one Prismatic. So you should always be prepared for that. So you should try and play with like a lot of HP. But any comp could be good. But just note that if it's a Prismatic ender, it doesn't matter how strong your comp is sometimes, because sometimes people can get bailed out by a very strong augment and you might not be able to match that. So you got to be a little bit prepared for that. But typically these are like low variance, normal games that you could just like play around. Jinx is Scuttle Puddle or Crab Rave, so that's what they used to be called, but basically all the monsters are replaced with these crabs that then give bonus loot. If it's Scuttle Puddle, then what happens is all the crabs don't really do damage in PvE rounds, so you can play like really weak boards. You don't have to worry about like losing to Krugs or anything like that. But with Crab Rave, there's like this big boss that happens at the end of stage 5 and onwards, where you have to like kill this crab that does a bunch of damage to your board. It's a 10% encounter, so 10% of the time you can see this. 7.5 are going to be Scuttle, and 2.5% are going to be the Rave version. So the Rave version is a little bit scarier, but trust me, there's not much to worry about there. Typically, Scuttle Puddle is a very high variance portal. It's a very high variance encounter. And the reason is that high rollers high roll harder. I'm going to say this many times as my little tongue twister. High rollers high roll harder. The idea is that if you just pump a lot of extra resources at different boards, how you use those resources really affects what happens in the game. So let's say somebody has a really strong opener and they hit their units very fast, right? They're going to get a bunch of gold and they're going to get a bunch of items, so they're going to be able to like swell up their boards a lot faster. Somebody who hits a 2-star 4 cost in a few rolls is going to be able to go straight to level 9 very fast and be able to roll on level 9 and cap very high. Meanwhile, if you spend a lot of gold looking for a particular unit, you might eventually hit the unit because you are getting a lot of gold, but because there's a huge disparity and they keep pumping gold at you, in addition to also other resources like components and other things, it becomes a real amount of disparity between somebody who low rolls and somebody that high rolls. And that's where the large variance can come from. If you low roll in Scuttle Puddle or in Crab Rave, you really feel it, because now you're going to be losing rounds by a significantly bigger margin, right? The high roller is going to absolutely decimate your board because they've capped out a lot higher than you, as opposed to in other portals, like for example with no encounter, they don't have the time to ramp up their board as fast because they don't have as many resources. So there's a much larger disparity, and that's why it can be very high variance. Now, because Scuttle Puddle and Crab Rave gives you so much gold, you typically want to avoid econ augments, just because you're going to have enough gold anyways. You usually want to prioritize combat or other things like that, because like I said, you want to make your board as strong as possible, because if other people are able to cap their boards very high, the best thing that you can do as a defensive measure is to make sure your board is as strong as possible. And something like an econ augment isn't that useful if you already have an infinite amount of resources that you can use. Of course, you can still low roll, and you can make an argument for econ augments in certain comps, like something like Emissary. That's a very expensive board if you watch my Emissary guide. I wouldn't worry too much about econ augments though. Typically when the portal is giving you a bunch of gold, you might want to just prioritize something else to make your board strong. Also, you want to angle yourself towards boards that cap high with many items. With more items, you're typically anticipating to play around multiple carries. Think something like Heimer Sentinels, where you have multiple backline units, both AD and AP, that can make use of many different items. That's something that is quite useful in something like Scuttle Puddle. Something like Emissary, where you're going to have multiple units that do a lot of work or do a lot of damage towards your late game. That's something that also helps out. Typically, you don't want to play like a solo carry, like Hero Augment, where only one unit does everything and you're putting all your resources into one unit. Stuff like that is a little bit more awkward in Scuttle Puddle, just because if you don't have a secondary unit that can do or make use of these items, then it becomes a little bit awkward in the very late game when you have so many resources to cap your board very high. Often you want to try and level as well. I usually recommend not to play reroll. Reroll is typically bad in Scuttle Puddle, just because like you can high roll or low roll your reroll, but you want to make sure that like reroll is all about consistency. It's about hitting a board that is relatively strong, and then you usually bleed out to like some sort of top 4. You usually don't go first with a reroll. You typically go somewhere in the top 4. With Scuttle Puddle, a lot of boards are going to cap very high, so that you often get out capped and you don't get to roll for higher cost units because you're spending your time rolling for your low cost units. Typically, you want to try and play around boards like 4 cost, 5 cost carries, because you want to be at those higher levels, so you have a higher chance of finding those upgraded 5 costs because you have so many resources, and it can greatly affect the outcome of the fight, especially late game. Now, if you do have a really good spot for reroll, then the same argument applies, right? If you hit all your units and you high roll your reroll very hard, then you'll have enough gold to level straight to 8, straight to 9, and still find the legendaries. So it works out both ways, but that's why I say don't just like commit to a reroll idea unless you have a really good spot for it, because it could actually hurt you very hard in something like Scuttle Puddle or Crab Rave. Also, to prepare for the crab, typically you need something with like Omnivamp or like, you know, melee carries work really well against the crab. Other than that, 5 costs are good against the crab, but most boards will lose to it if you don't have those type of things going for you. I Vander. So I didn't actually have a picture. I haven't had a Vander game in my last week, apparently. I went through all my VODs. That's why this video is really late. I was trying to get the pictures for these slides. So I just put a picture of Vander here. With Vander, basically what you get is 3 gold augments. So this is once again a 10% encounter. And it's pretty low variance. The gold augments this set seem to be relatively balanced. There's not those big outliers where some gold augments are ridiculously strong. So it's typically low variance. Very similar to like the other low variance portals. It's very simple. Anything can go. You don't have to really like think about a certain strategy overarching everything. You usually want to prioritize a mixture of augments as per usual. Early econ is really good in this set right now. Combat augments so that you actually have some power for late game. These are things that can matter a lot. But additionally, something that matters sometimes with the Vander one is fishing for really good options. The way TFT works is that if you see an augment, you cannot see the augment again later. So if you see an augment and you roll past it, every augment that you see, like those cards, they never get recycled. You never get to see them again. So sometimes if you're looking for something very specific, you can occasionally thin out the deck by rolling through the augments and then hit something really good. This works a lot with spatulas. So for example, if you're looking for a particular emblem, it's a lot easier to hit in Vander augments or in Vander portals or encounters. Sorry, I say portals because they used to be called portals. Now they're encounters because it's not like you don't stand on a portal. So sorry if I confuse the words a little bit. But with Vander encounter, sometimes you can see, like, if you have, like, you know, let's say you got a spatula off of carousel, it might be a little bit more of a viable strategy to try and get that +2 prismatic trait activated or prismatic synergy activated, because you can thin out the deck. It's not a good option, but it's like something that sometimes happens. So like, you know, it's just like, you know, you can play towards it. I've seen people talk about it and play towards that in the past, so just make a mental note of it. Vi. So Vi component anvils. So component anvils, 10% encounter. This is pretty low variance. So basically you start the game off with 2 component anvils. It's quite flexible. Reroll is often good because you can guarantee items. A lot of times with reroll, especially if you're committing to a reroll early, is that you can grief buy items later. With 2 component anvils, you have a good opportunity to make at least 2 or 3 good items for your carries without having to worry about item drops. So that's very nice. Additionally, win streaking is very strong and very good because if you actually pop the anvils early, you can make your board very strong because you basically have a good opportunity of slamming multiple items on the same unit and then carry stacking that unit. So if you start the game off and you have an upgraded unit, you can just build a bunch of items for that particular unit without having to worry about item drops and then tempo it very aggressively. So win streaking is very viable, but also it doesn't completely eliminate lose streaking and making perfect items because you have a bunch of component anvils. There's lots of comeback mechanic in this galaxy, but typically when I see it, I try to go for a win streak if I have the opportunity to. Next, Mel. So Mel, now we're into the lower percentage chance options. So this encounter happens 8% of the time and it's very high variance. Basically what happens is you get some sort of powerful loot at 40 player health. I'm actually going to show you the loot table. So if you don't want to get spoiled of it, I don't know, maybe if you're a casual player, I'll show it right after this slide. So you can just kind of like skim or skip through it if you don't want to see it. But basically when you're playing around the Mel cash out, you don't know what the cash out is until somebody hits 40 HP. So what you should always do is scout low HP players. If you're somebody who's not low HP in the game, you want to make sure that if you see somebody that's around 40 HP, you want to look at their board. Because as soon as they pick up the drop, then you know what the drop is. The earlier you have the information of what the drop is, the less variance you will have to encounter with the Mel Encounter, basically. Because the problem is with the cash outs, they're very polarizing. Sometimes they can completely put you in a winning spot. And sometimes if you get the cash out a lot later in the game, you can't play around it as well. It takes too long to like fix your board to actually make use of the powerful loot. So then it becomes really complicated. And it can greatly change your strategy, which we'll talk about once we look at the loot table. Win streaking can also be hard because, like I said, if you win streak and you're not getting the cash out until much later in the game, you're basically forced to play towards a comp with the anticipation of a cash out later. And if you win streak and you don't have perfect items because you didn't get priority pick on carousel, and then your cash out, you can't make use of it right away, things can get out of hand really fast. A lot of times if you're win streaking, there's a good chance that like out of nowhere, the people that were lose streaking just win with the Mel play, win out with the powerful loot because they can make use of it. And by the time you get your cash out, it's like too little too late. You can't actually like make your board use it well, especially if you're not paying attention to what the cash out is. But it's very high variance because it doesn't matter what you're playing. A lot of times by the time you reach 40 HP, you already have to make decisions in the game in order to like get to that point, and then it can often grief you. Typically what you do want to do is play towards comps that use emblems, because some of the cash outs give you spatulas as well as frying pans. It is very RNG, but you should always like keep open a board that uses emblems, or uses them to spike pretty well. This is the cash out table with the percentage chance of each of them occurring. So as you can see, there's many different options. Many of them have some rendition of a spatula or a frying pan. That's why I say you should always play a comp in this galaxy that makes use of a spatula. Now the frying pan is less common than the spatula. The spatula is quite common. Also with the frying pan, you often get a reforger, so you want to be very careful around that. It's harder to get a frying pan, so you know, playing around something like, for example, Pit Fighter, trying to think that you're going to hit 8 Pit Fighter, unless you know what the cash out is, that's not a viable option. But with spatulas, it makes a lot of sense. A little bit more, like if you're trying to play around like, I don't know, Black Rose or Rebel, you might easily hit like 7 or 10 or one of those traits. Often, especially if you have like a wandering trainer or augments like that. Additionally, there's a lot of these that give duplicators, so you could hold on to extra copies of 4 cost and 5 cost units and maybe hit a 3-star version of that. These games can get really wild really fast, so pay attention to what the cash out is, make sure that's incorporated into your strategy and try and make use of it. But like I said, it could be very RNG because you have to make a lot of decisions and you have to play like your best board and play the game of TFT. You can't just like do nothing until you see the cash out and then make decisions, because that's not a good way to play either. Victor, holy shit. No, I'm joking. I won't complain too much about this, but Victor basically makes it so 6 costs appear on stage 4. This one is an 8% encounter. It has very high variance. It's not really a way to play around this very well. I can't give you many tips. Any strategy is fine. You just gotta hope that you hit a 6 cost. A lot of times people hit 6 costs out everywhere during this encounter, and it greatly sways the fight. I'm not a big fan of 6 costs. I know some people might be, some people might not be. I'm just saying from my perspective, the way that I look at it. Right now, 6 costs are in a weird spot for me. The odds of it are not low enough that you never see a 6 cost, and the odds aren't high enough that you can guarantee a 6 cost. And I think the game has to pick one of the two options, because right now they're like in the middle where you see them quite often, but you can't guarantee them. And the problem is, if you don't hit a 6 cost, you're at a clear deficit a lot of the time, relative to other boards. The Victor Galaxy makes it significantly worse, because them appearing early on stage 4, that's where everybody does their initial roll down to like spike their board, right? A lot of times like 4-1, 4-2 is where you're rolling for 4 costs, where you're rolling for other units, right? Like 4 costs and reroll comms spike around that point. I think they can appear a little bit earlier than stage 4. I don't know exactly when they start appearing. I didn't look that up for this guide. But either way, the idea is that if you make the odds occur a lot earlier and make the odds higher, it's not high enough such that you guarantee getting a 6 cost, because sometimes you can roll like 50 gold. The odds are low enough that you're not statistically likely to find one, but at the same time, in a lobby of 8 people, there's a good chance that at least one of you guys is going to find one, and that can greatly sway the outcome of the fight. So I would suggest playing strategies that give you a lot of HP, just to make sure that you have a little bit of wiggle room if people hit something crazy. Don't try and play on a very thin margin is what I would say. You also want to play a board that has an open spot so you can actually play the 6 cost. Additionally, rerolls can be good, sometimes because they can help you find the 6 cost if you're rolling a lot of gold early on stage 4. But something else is also to take spatula augments. A lot of times just having augments where you play towards a vertical trait, it gives you that flexibility to put an extra unit on your board. For example, if you have a Rebel +1, it becomes a lot easier to just slot in any of the 6 cost units, because you just put the Rebel emblem on them and now they become a Giga Rebel 6 cost unit. Or let's say you're playing around something else, I don't know, like Pit Fighter. I'm just picking random things, right? But let's say you have a Pit Fighter emblem and then you just put it on a random unit, or Automata emblem, you put it on a random unit. These help out a lot in actually like realizing the full potential of the 6 cost, because then they become, not only are they a really strong unit, in terms of their base abilities and stats, but they also get the benefit of whatever trait that you're playing around. So spatulas and emblem augments, try and prioritize those if you see them. They're often pretty good in something like this. Warwick. I hate this one. We're going to talk about this one for a little bit. This one I'm actually going to bitch about. I'm joking, but I'll try and keep it polite and as nice as possible. But I hate this one the most. 8% encounter. I think that's way too high. I'll talk about it later. But very high variance. So I'm going to give you guys an analogy. Basically, the way Warwick works is that it's like the augment Spoils of War. If you've ever seen Spoils of War, every time you kill an enemy champion, you get some form of loot. It starts out by being a little bit of gold, then it can turn into lesser duplicators, and eventually can turn into components and other high value loot. The idea, I think somebody said that it's very similar to Spoils of War Gold Spoils of War, in terms of the percentages and what you can get. The problem is that I'll give you guys an analogy, right? We recently talked about Scuttle Puddle and how you can get a bunch of gold and high rollers can high roll really hard and they can become very strong because you just get this influx of a huge amount of gold. With Warwick's, the way that it works is that you need to kill units. You need to have units that basically do work, right? The way you can look at it is like, it's like Scuttle Puddle where you get a bunch of gold and you get a bunch of resources, but you also have to kill units. What that does is it forces your hand a little bit. The best strategy almost always is that you want to play your strongest board. You want to play as strong a board as possible in order to kill as many units as possible. Killing more units gives you more gold, and giving you more gold gives you like much more potential to cap out your board, hit your units. The problem is the high rollers high roll harder here. What if you don't have a good opener? What if you start the game and you don't have any units that are upgraded? A lot of times, like you start the game off, you look at your board and you're like, this is a board that's not very strong. One of the fundamental aspects of TFT, this is the part that frustrates me about this portal or encounter. One of the fundamental aspects, of TFT is the comeback mechanic of losing rounds to prioritize carousel picks as well as to give you gold to then come back in the game. There's not that much of a comeback mechanic. If you lose streak, like let's say you decide to make your board slightly weaker because you're like, okay, I'm going to prioritize losing these rounds because I need carousel pick, I don't have a strong opener, I don't have unit upgrades. If you do that, you are so far behind from the people that are actually killing units that you basically just cancel yourself out of the game. So what you're doing is when you play this galaxy, if you don't have a good opener a lot of the times, or if you low roll at any point in the game, like let's say you low roll on your stage 4 roll down, or you roll down on your stage 3 roll down, a lot of times it's like the people that hit just continue to get gold, but you get nothing in return, because if you're just losing by a lot of units, or if you don't hit and you don't have the lose streaking, or like playing around like, okay, I can spike later by saving and rebuilding my econ and doing other, like these strategies don't work anymore because you're just down so much resources. So you're kind of forced to always be pushing, and then you just gotta hope that you get bailed out later a lot of the time. Things like bad component drops, things like bad carousels, like things like that can really dramatically affect your placement. And when you're trying to force a position to be a good position when it's not a good position, that's how you lose games really easily. So it's a very RNG, it's very high variance. On a surface level, it's like, it's fun because you can just like play the strongest board and you just try and play a strong board. But like, if you don't have a good spot for a strong board, often you're just signing a death warrant for yourself, and there's nothing you can do. So that's why I don't enjoy it. But of course, if you enjoy it, that's I'm not trying to rain on the parade or anything. By all means, enjoy it. But for me at least, this encounter, as well as some of the other ones that they added, like all the ones that they added in the recent patch that all have an 8% encounter rate that we've been going through here, like these are the reasons why I might stop playing this set. If they don't lower these encounter rates, I don't know. This one is miserable for me every time I play it. But either way, you have to kill units to keep up with the lobby. That's the main thing. So you always want to play a strong board. I would always recommend slamming items as often as possible. On carousel pick, try and complete your items as soon as possible. Reroll if possible. If you have a spot that looks like you can reroll a unit, like let's say you hit a 1 cost and you find a couple copies of a 1 cost, or a 2 cost and you find a bunch of copies of a 2 cost, angle yourself towards the rerolls, because being strong early gives you gold early, and having gold early gives you more interest, and getting more interest will let you cap your board significantly higher than everybody else. TFT is all about gold. So if you can get the gold early, you get the gold as early as you can. So that is the main important thing. So if you're struggling with Warwicks, you have to try your best to build strong boards early. Lose streaking is a really bad idea often, and like, you know, try and cap out your board as high as possible. Echo all prismatic. So Echo, basically all the augments are prismatic. These can be low or high variance. It depends on what you hit. Some of the prismatics are really broken, so you know, you can high cap your board with really good combat prismatics, but you can fall really far behind if you don't hit combat. However, because all of the augments are prismatic, you don't have a problem with like something like a prismatic ender with Heimerdinger, where it's a lot higher variance. Because you get to pick every single augment, you can also thin out the pool a little bit. So the same thing I was talking about before with like the Vander example, you can't see the same augments twice. You don't get offered the same augment more than once. So what ends up happening a lot of times with prismatics is that if you see an augment that you like, you can take it. If you don't like them, then by rolling all of them that you don't like or you don't think you'll have use for in your game, then you're more likely to hit the other ones that are good. So there's a good chance you will, if you don't see a combat augment your first choice or your second choice or your third choice, you will definitely find one, so you can keep up with the lobby pretty well. That's the thing. So you could fall far behind if you don't hit certain powerful augments that work well with your board to bring out the maximum potential of your units, but at the same time, you have a good chance of hitting them because they're all prismatic. So you can take an econ, you can play it similar to like gold augments. You have a lot of opportunity to play different things, which is very nice. There's some high roll options, right? Things if people hit like artifacts, there's a lot of artifact combos. Everybody knows about a Nocturne with range, for example. Things like Prismatic Pipeline is not very balanced. It's pretty bad. They tried to nerf it, but it's still really bad, so expect more nerfs next time they patch it. But there's certain augments like that where they can hit win conditions really aggressively because these prismatics are very strong. So make sure to scout often and adjust your strategy accordingly. You can't necessarily say, oh, I'm winning this game for free. I have this strong board. It's like, you know, maybe somebody just hit some crazy bullshit and you didn't look at their board, right? You have to be a little bit more vigilant. Make sure that every time they pick an augment, double check to see if they hit anything ridiculous. Powder. So powder, basically the clapping monkey toy appears at 3-5 and it has one of multiple effects. This is a 5% encounter, and it can have very low variance or it can have high variance. It does depend on what the cash out is, but typically it's not that big of a deal. You usually just want to be prepared for the monkey at 3-5. Try not to lose streak or play with low HP. So here I show, there's a little table. I forget what website I took this from, but credit to the website. It was from Tactor. It was a Tactor guide. I'll try and link it in the description if I remember. But basically with the wind up monkey, there's a 25% chance that you take 10 player damage, get a masterwork upgrade, 25 gold, or 4 random components. So getting the gold, you can use the gold in many different ways. That's fine. Masterwork upgrade, you should always be prepared that you know which radiant items are good for your carries. You can look that up yourself, or you can like just anticipate based on what you think you need. Components can be hard to play around sometimes depending on what components you get, but be prepared to have a bunch of items. But the 10 player damage is the one that you could actively think about. You want to not lose too much HP while playing this. If you can, try to win streak and not to lose streak. Don't play something like Chem Baron. I made that mistake once. I forgot it was the powder monkey encounter and I just died instantly because I was trying to play Chem Baron and I just died to the monkey without having to get my cash out. So that was really funny one time on stream. But that's what I mean. Try and play around having more HP just in case it's the 10 player damage. You don't want to put yourself in a bad spot where you're like, oh, now I'm definitely gonna die here because there's a really strong guy in the lobby and I just lost 10 HP and I don't have a way out, right? Try and prioritize saving some HP. You have to adjust to the cash out. So this is where it could be a little bit of high variance, but it's not that bad. I would say it's like of the high variance examples is not the worst one. You want to play towards comps with high itemizations as well as sometimes high cap, especially if you get a bunch of gold. Because if you're just going to punt away all the gold doing nothing, then you don't make use of it as well as other people in your lobby and you can fall behind. Ambessa! So Ambessa is Wandering Golem. So this is a 4% encounter and it's quite high variance. So basically you're going to get a golem with 3 different emblems on it. These can be craftable or uncraftable, but basically you get 3 emblems and you have to play around it. The reason it's very high variance is because you don't really know what the emblems are, and you kind of have to find a way to play around them. A lot of creative boards can come from Ambessa, like Ambessa golems. I have fun sometimes with Wandering Golem, but sometimes it's miserable. Typically what you want to do is you want to try and make use of at least 2 of the emblems. That's my general rule of thumb. Try and think of a board that uses 2 out of the 3 emblems at minimum. A lot of times you can get baited by trying to use all the emblems, like, oh, I'll use this and this and this and play this unit, and then all your units do nothing. A lot of times it's best to try and think of boards that are already strong, units that are already strong, and find a way to link it together such that you're using at least 2. That would be my recommendation. But often your board is dictated by this encounter, and because your board is dictated by the encounter, that's where the variance comes into play. Some people can hit really strong boards. Often, like, this is the galaxy where people hit the crazy prismatic verticals, right? If you have a rebel emblem on your golem, now you can hit rebel without going to level 10, right? You find, right, if you have a golem, then your augments can still offer you the spatula, so you can easily hit like +2 for certain like traits, and things get out of hand really fast. So you want to try and play as safely as possible, but at the same time, you're forced to play whatever your golem has a lot of the time, and that makes it really awkward, because if you don't have a good spot, you don't have good items for it, it can get out of hand really fast. The worst is if your golems are contested. There's many times where I have like the same golem as somebody else, or very close to the same golem as somebody else, and it's like, oh great, now we're gonna be butting heads the whole game, and everybody else gets to play the game for free. That's the worst. You can play for placements. Try to match items with the augments or the golem. Don't just try and tunnel vision and say, oh, there's a rebel emblem on my dude, I'm just gonna play for 10 rebel, GG, shake my hand. It's like, well, make sure that you still have a spot. Try and find the best spot that you have for the comp that realigns with your golems in terms of like units and items and all of that. So, you know, but it is very variance, because sometimes you just don't get the right tools to make things work. And sometimes people hit the crazy shit, like 7 Black Rose, 10 Rebel, 9 Scrap, like all these crazy things that just insta-win the game. So the lobbies are often dictated by who has a better golem. So you have to be prepared to just play for placements, play for 4th, keep your HP high, bleed out so that you don't go 8th and you don't lose too much LP. Caitlyn Gold Sub. Caitlyn's my favorite, by the way. I think Caitlyn, it could be high variance. I just put low variance here because I feel like out of all of the high variance examples, this one's like the lowest variance. It's a 4% encounter, and basically what it does is every stage you get some gold. It doesn't tell you exactly how much gold you get, but you get a certain amount of gold. Because you're getting a lot of gold, you should always think about expensive boards. I love to play towards something like Emissary when it's gold sub. Emissary is also good with like Scuttle Puddle and other things that you get a lot of gold. The reason is that when you have a board that's really expensive and the portal is giving you a bunch of gold, you can actually make use of that gold pretty effectively. It's very flexible. You can reroll, but you want to make sure your spot is good. It's the same argument as Scuttle Puddle. People are going to be capping really high and putting a bunch of legendaries and making their boards really, really expensive. So if you're rerolling and you're trying to play like this safe board, sometimes you just look at somebody else's board and they have a bunch of upgraded 5 costs, and then you have no way of competing with them. I like to roll at higher levels typically, but if you have a really good spot for a reroll, same thing applies. You can hit your units fast, and then you can level and get the 5 costs anyway, so it's totally good. So it's viable both ways. You want to sometimes avoid econ augments, right? If you get a lot of gold early that you already establish a bank really well, you can scout when you're picking your first augment, because if somebody picks an augment faster than you, you can see how much gold they get, because sometimes you start the game off with a bunch of gold and then you don't really need an econ augment because you have the gold to set up your bank, and then it might be like a little bit worse than just taking combat. But you also have to adjust your strategy fast. A lot of times in gold sub, especially late game, you get dropped like an absolute nuke amount of gold, and then people just randomly roll down and hit a 3-star 4 cost or something like that. So you gotta be prepared for that, right? You gotta know your outs, right? If I get a bunch of gold, am I leveling? Am I rolling? Am I going for 5 costs? Am I rolling for 6 costs? What is my next in? You have to like plan ahead a little bit, because sometimes you just get dropped like 50 gold, boom. And it's like, okay, do I level? Do I roll? Do I do what? It's like that's usually where you fall into traps. So you gotta be prepared. You gotta know your outs, and just play around that a little bit, right? Know that in the future, if you get a bunch of gold, what can you do with it? Just be prepared for it. Jace, Artifact Anvil. I hate this one. 4% encounter, very high variance, I would say. So the problem with Artifact Anvils is that the way that they reworked artifacts a couple sets ago, they added a bunch of artifacts, and now there's like these certain combinations. It happens every set, so you can't even blame, like, you know, play testing and all of that. Like, I know like everybody makes jokes and stuff, but there's often going to be a set of artifacts that are like game winning. They are very strong in combination with certain units. Think about Nocturne with RFC, Nocturne with snipers, but most importantly, Nocturne with fishbones, which is ridiculous. All of these are really strong game-winning options. If you see one of those artifacts, you can just often force towards it and win the game for free. Additionally, Trenchcoat with Violet, Trenchcoat with Ambessa. There's some other ones that are very niche that I went through. I did an Ornn artifact guide, and I kind of tried to show all of them, as many as I could. But the lobbies can get out of hand very fast. Because you're forced to play around an artifact, you basically have to rip this artifact at the beginning of the game, see if you hit something good, or you have to play for like a top 4, right? The worst parts of these are when multiple people hit insanely good artifacts for their units. Then it becomes very out of hand very fast. You know, you gotta hope that you hit an artifact that fits your board. The bigger problem isn't the fact that, like, you know, obviously there's game-winning artifacts and there's artifacts that aren't game-winning. I understand that. The reason that I say it's high variance isn't because, like, I'm anticipating that I'm going to play Nocturne every time I see Jace. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is, you need to rip that artifact, and sometimes you open it, and you get, like, 3 AD items, and you have a bunch of AP items. And it's like, now what do I do? Or sometimes you get an artifact that's, like, very, like, specific in terms of what it can do, and then it's like, okay, so now I'm just forcing myself towards playing these specific sets of units that I don't have items for, but I can, like, structure my game plan. I can play around these specific items, but, like, you play around the specific items, and now, like, what if you don't hit? Because if you don't have, like, a spot for it at the beginning of the game, and your mid game doesn't go well, you can't just, like, magically make it work out. That's the problem with it. And because some of the artifacts are very circumstantial, like, you look at them, and it's like, if this unit shields, make them do this. It's like, yes, but, like, it's stage 2. I don't have a unit that shields right now. Like, do I take this, or what do I do? What if I don't hit a unit that shields now? What if I don't hit it on stage 3? Like, what do I do? I'm just gonna lose every round? It's like stuff like that makes it really annoying. But what I would suggest is that you look at your artifacts. You have to have a good understanding of artifacts when you're playing this. I recommend looking at my guide if you want a little brief introduction. But you figure it out. See what you can do. There's lots of options that are less picked. They're not necessarily game-winning, but take the thing that's strongest for your board at the time. If you don't have, like, a game-winning thing that you think you can win the game with, take something that at least gives you value on stage 2 and stage 3, right? If you hit an artifact that fits your board, take it, because then you at least guarantee that you have HP to work with, so that if somebody hits a broken combination, you're not the first one to die. And that's, like, the best, that's like the best strategy you can have. Take something that fits your board. Don't tunnel vision too hard on this will work with this, which will work with this, because I saw it in a YouTube guide that will make this guy a giga unit, and all I have to do is hit this augment and this anomaly and this. It's like, no, that's not gonna happen. Just take the one that works with your board. Preserve HP. Play for 4th. If you get better than 4th, you're overjoyed. You go to the lottery. You get a scratch ticket, and you have a great day. Like, that's what you gotta do. Right? It is what it is. It's all in a day's work, right? It's Jace Ornn artifacts. That's what it is. But also, additionally, something that works out really well with Ornn artifacts is taking artifact augments. If you get artifact augments, combinations of Ornn artifacts are sometimes broken combinations. Let's say you start the game off and you see a Zonya's, take another Ornn artifact. Maybe you hit Trenchcoat. Now you just went from, like, a game neutral position that's like, this is pretty good, to, like, an insta-win position. Always try and take artifact augments, I would say. It does help out quite a bit. In this particular galaxy, because of the combinations between them. Seva Loot subscription. So this is a 4% encounter rate. It's very high variance. Typically you want to play boards that spike with spatulas. So the way Loot Sub works. Ooh, did I die? Oh, sorry. I'll do it like this so you guys can see it over time, so it's not overwhelming. It's pretty high variance. Basically the way Loot Sub works is that every stage you get some loot from a pool, which we'll talk about in a second. You want to play boards that spike with spatulas often. The reason is that there's a good chance that you get a spatula through the Seva Loot Sub. So often people can hit game-winning positions by just having, like, 2 spatulas for a particular augment. For a particular trait. So you hit a Prismatic. You also want to be prepared for flexible pivots if possible. It's often very difficult, to play around the Loot Sub if you get something that you're not sure, like, is a game winning. Like, there's an Ornn artifact that you can get off Seva, right? That's what I mean. You gotta be prepared. Like, you see the Ornn artifact, oh shit, I can win with this, and you gotta be prepared to, like, shift your boards on the fly. So typically I say that you should always play for the high roll. With Loot Sub, a big skill is to understand how to play for a high roll, which is a completely different thing. But the idea is that, like, you know, let's say you're playing Seva, right? Maybe avoid rerolls because that's harder to high roll. Rerolls are more about consistency than, like, capping your board very high. Avoid something like built different, right? Built different can't make use of a spatula. I know that sounds really obvious, but trust me, like, I made that mistake, not this set, but like last set, and it scarred me for life. Or sorry, 2 sets ago. I did this in set like 11. Which one was the one with Inkborn? 11? Yeah, set 11, I did that one time and I got railed and I said never again. Why was I so stupid? Obviously you don't take built different with Loot Sub. I have like 10 spatulas I can't make use of. You know, stuff like that. Don't take forcing boards that force you to play a certain way, because you got to be prepared for like these high rolls. Additionally, emblem augments are really good because they're a good chance to hit a +2, right? If you take something like Wandering Trainer, where you get a dummy with a bunch of emblems, you might be able to get +2 of a certain trait, and then all of a sudden you're in a game-winning spot. So for example, with Sevika, these are the Loot Sub options. So you have a 14% chance of a spatula, you get gold, a 2-star unit of the stage -1, artifact, components, support items. The boot just means that you get nothing, and there's like a small chance of a tactician's crown and a reforger. These are things that could, like, you know, some of them are utility based, but some of them, like especially the spatula and the artifact, you got to be prepared for boards. Like, know if you're playing a certain board, if you're playing very narrow, what the win cons are for that board, so that if you hit these things, you're not surprised and you kind of like are aware or know of it, if that's the case. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. So those are all the encounters and what I talked about. So I made this joke with like some of them being like, you know, not that I don't like them or high variance or whatever. Obviously, TFT is all about dealing with variance. So if there are encounters that you don't particularly like, that's fine. I don't like a lot of them either. But what I would say is that try and have strategies that take into account the encounter. One of the worst things you can do in TFT is not consider the encounter when you're picking augments or when you're deciding on a board, right? Like, let's say you see Chem Baron. It doesn't matter if you have 3 Chem Baron units. If you're playing Chem Baron and it's like some crazy portal that doesn't allow for lose streaking very well. Like, let's say you hit a bunch of Chem Barons and it's Warwick's Hunger. Sometimes if you don't have a good Chem Baron cash out, and if everybody's playing really temple strong boards, a lot of times you lose too much HP, you have to set on a lower cash out and you can die instantly, right? Of course, if you have a really good Chem Baron spot, maybe play it there, but I'm just trying to give you examples, right? Think about what other people are going to do. Think about the best way to use the portal or the encounter. Sorry, I say portal, encounter interchangeably, but the best way to use the encounter, and then structure that into your ideas so that you can actually win out or have the best chance of winning. Thanks for watching. Part 2, sorry, this was the wrong slide. I just messed up this PowerPoint because I had to do it late because I had issues today. But tomorrow I will probably do the part 2 of the other video that I made, which is going to be talking about some best comps to try and climb with and like what their conditions are and stuff like that. I'm still working on that presentation as well. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.